Thank you, everybody. And I think we have pretty much everyone who's going to be here tonight. So I appreciate that, especially as we start making our meetings more frequent as we get closer to the budget deadline. We want to make use, since we're asking more people's time, we want to make good use of that. So thank you everybody for coming, and I want to get started with the approval of last meeting's minutes. Did those get sent out? Missed it. Yes.
I'm not seeing the recording, but maybe it's my internet lag. But Terry, we're getting ready to start now. We can start recording.
Okay. Thank you very much, Terry. And good catch there, Claire. I forgot to look for that, so I appreciate that. Do we have the minutes for last meeting? I may have missed them in my email thread. Oh, Roger has them? Okay. I appreciate that.
They were linked this time around versus an attachment.
Yes. Yeah. They were in the email and the link.
Okay. Well, thank you. So are there any corrections to the minutes, or shall we approve them as submitted?
I move that we approve them as submitted.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'll second. This is Brad.
Appreciate it. Then we'll consider those adopted and move on to the discussion of the proposed budget. So Norberto, you put together, thank you very much for the agenda. I wanted to make sure that, did you want to start with reviewing the state level funding numbers? Is that something you have in front of you?
Yeah, I certainly can, and totally flexible if CBRC wishes to talk, or start in a different area. I have a handful of slides to just share from Tuesday night's conversation. And so if it's okay, I can go ahead and share my screen.
Norberto, is it okay if we do roll call first, just to ensure that we have all of our members and
Absolutely.
to register who are not present for our meeting, just to make it fast? Instead of asking you to say present, I'm just going to read the list that I have showing present on the list. And if I don't call your name, because there are phone numbers calling into the meeting, then say your name and present. Okay? I'm going to go. You're welcome. I have Ben Nelson in the meeting, Claire Hertz, Irina Phillips, Jackson Weinberg, Jennifer Samuels, Judah McCauley, Lisa Selman, Norberto Delgadillo, Roger Kirchner, Sarah Kerr, and our comms technician, Terry Proctor. Am I missing someone that's present with us that I didn't call you?
Who is the call-in number? Irina, are you called in separately on your phone? No?
I suspect it might be Anderson or whatever is the name of the lady who uses the daughter's computer.
Renee Anderson, can you verify? Renee Anderson, can you verify if you are in the meeting?
We have an email from Renee just from a few moments ago that she's unfortunately unable to join. So I'm guessing it's not her.
We might say the call-in number ends with a 00, unless, is that the mask? Or if your number ends in 00, tell us who you are.
Is it a *6 to unmute? I know it is for Zoom, but I'm not sure for Google.
It won't let me unmute the phone, but I think I have an idea. I think it is Leisha Posey. Leisha, are you with us tonight? I can check in with her in a second via text. We can proceed for tonight's meeting.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that.
Thank you indeed. And so I do have a few slides that I'd love to share. The presentation that we shared on, sorry, I am trying to get the right screen. Hey, it worked. Okay, I'm getting better at this. And so the presentation that was shared on Tuesday had some of the information that we discussed at our last CBRC meeting, in addition to a few additional, more details that I just spend a few minutes highlighting them. And of course, if there's other questions that we can definitely talk to. And in full transparency, it's also part of my continuing growth and understanding. And I was actually commenting earlier, I love to hear questions, because then it's like, oh yeah, let's unpack that or figure out this conversation or further support the conversation. And one slide that I will point out is slide 6 of the deck that was in the link in the materials. And really, the goal of this slide is to take out the portion of our budget that in traditional sense we think about as our operating budget. So a lot of times we propose all the times we propose our budget. And in this case, it's $2 billion. And then there may be some misunderstanding like, wow, that's $2 billion. And I'm like, well, actually the operating component of that is a general fund and the special revenue fund, because the other pieces of that are tied to bond, paying back the bond, the debt service, workers' comp. So it's just pointing that out. And I would imagine for most of our CBRC committee members, that's common knowledge, but usually, right, public and a variety of other folks who may be used to these recordings or otherwise, I think it's always important to just call that out. So I wanted to point that slide out. And then on slide 16, we added a few more details to start bringing out the budget, because let's be honest, right? The budget's a very technical document, and there's a lot of amazing things that are happening in the district that just get lost. And so part of this ongoing process is to pull out some of those investments and amazing things that the district's doing. And by no means is this an exhausted list, and it's just like a snapshot. And they're still working on putting additional components and pieces together to further flesh out or further highlight some of the key aspects. But in the previous slide, we shared regarding the proposed investment plan and like our continued focus is safety, stabilizing staff ratios at schools, learning acceleration, supporting the evolution of the strategic plan and meeting board goals. And then it's in essence, double clicking, right? Getting into that. So when we think about $16 million in supporting learning acceleration by investing in areas such as working with community partners for the summer programming, really focusing on credit recovery, providing Saturday school, additional social workers for some of our middle schools, thinking about professional development and investing in our workforce, along with our continued partnerships, putting additional instructional specialists in some of our schools that require more supports. And on the next slide, it's a continuation of that. And how are we also thinking about our support to our commitment to racial equity and social justice? How are we supporting our BIPOC students with racial affinity groups? In addition to our Native students and the type of efforts and investment that's happening there. And I'll also show like the other dimension, right? It's like the strategic and operational aspects to it. Something that we're all excited for is for the new year to begin and start and to all be back, right? That's the intention, for all of us to be back. And then there's this realization of, how do we prepare for a hybrid reversal? I couldn't think of a better way of putting it. So there's like now moving furniture, moving desks, and making adjustments. So that carries an expense. There's requirements for ventilation measures. Just like from now on, how do we keep the air running through the buildings? And there's additional utility costs. Kellogg, right? That's coming online. That's exciting. And there's a lot of work that needs to go into supporting the work at the school. And really, the very first item on this list is just trying to support staffing levels and mitigate the impact due to enrollment. And we touched on this last time, and that's also important for school leaders. They need to know, what their staffing situation looks like in order to then prepare and support and be ready for the upcoming year. And so I'll pause there just to see if there are any questions. There's one more, actually a few more slides that I'd love to share. But I just want to pause for a moment, and I see that Judah has raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you. Question on the staffing. In past years, we've taken an approach of reserving a certain number of FTEs for those kind of final rebalancing that always happens at the beginning of school years when we find out who's actually going to what school versus the projected. My kind of broad-based understanding is that we're expecting more uncertainty this fall than usual with the number of people that opted out and, the changes in remote work and, all sorts of things of that nature. How are we accounting for that in the FTE reserve plan? And kind of what's the approach that's being communicated with administrators for their fall planning?
Yeah, so essentially what we've done is taken our numbers from FY20. So we're not using this year because, right to your point, Judah, this year accounts for all the uncertainty. And, if you a statistician may take a step back and look at the trends and make a assumption for next year, for FY22, for the following school year. But from our perspective, we took where we were at in school year 1920, and then leveraging those numbers to then support and plug in for this upcoming year. And so that is the approach we're taking, and with the consideration that we're gonna wait and see as well as we get into that process, because we're hopeful a lot of families come back. We know that across the country, the expectation, same thing in Oregon, is that we want those pre-K or those kinder early learners to come back, because a lot of them just redshirted, right? They took a year off and did that, and then taking that into account, we're then assuming that we'll probably be overcompensating a little by leveraging FY20 or the from 1920 school year to then support for our planning for this upcoming year. And Clara, I don't know if you have additional
Sure.
insight to share.
Yeah, so we've staffed based on 1920 enrollment, so that we've overstaffed, especially in our elementary schools. I would say from 8th grade up, the enrollment has actually grown from projection. Well, kindergarten, 1st to 2nd are probably the ones most impacted, with kindergarten being the most. So we have been overstaffed in the primary grades, and we felt like if there were, as students are returning, having additional staff at primary grades just will lower class size. We also typically have a staffing reserve. that we keep we allocate some of it in the spring based on where we can see that where there's going to be issues, but we also true it up again early September when students show up. And I know that we'll be looking at that. This time there might be times where if we have, 2 students of 10 in a school, that we might need to move that teacher to another school rather than allocating another one. So we're going to be watching closely, and we also have set aside the possible use of ESSER funds to mitigate some of the class size issues as well.
Okay. And just as the follow-up to that, a couple of the things that were, kind of hot topics and planning oriented from the 2019-2020 budget included reducing the number of 4-5 splits, and then also trying to get closer to 2 strands in like each school, especially the Title I schools that had the smaller enrollments in it, and then also moving the cap size, the number of students per school or per class into the bonus formula, providing the extra money to the teachers that had, instead of making it our choice whether to add another resource and reduce class size, or basically pay them extra. Are all of those things, are those approaches still being captured in this budget that was kind of there in the 2019-2020 approach?
So we're still in a pandemic, so it will be different next year. And I'm sorry, Naberto, I don't mean to respond.
No, please, because I was going to turn it to you.
Okay.
I wasn't here then, so
I just
it works out.
So yes, so one of the things that we don't know, for instance, this year by school, we had some schools that had 80% students return. Another school would have 50% students return. So it varied across the district. So that is also adding a complexity to staffing, right? So that is another component that we need to watch closely, and we'll be responding to. And also just, still offering, working with, right now we're actually working on summer programs, but as soon as we get that work done, then we're going to, what are we doing with in the fall for the families that aren't ready to return until there's a vaccine for children. So there's those components as well that adds a little nuance. We're not sure in the fall if those that have stayed away will continue to want to stay away, or if, especially at probably high school, when we're actually looking at vaccines for students in high school, that where the state is already setting up where we can bus our students with, of course, parent permission to the convention center and get vaccines. So those are some components the state OHA, Oregon Health Authority, is helping us with. So it's all of those pieces around the pandemic are still things that we'll continue to work with in the fall.
But no particular plans or like guidelines along the, like, we're shooting for 2 strands, we're trying to minimize 4-5 splits. Basically, we're recognizing that we're still in a pandemic and we have much bigger variables that we need to deal with first, and so we're kind of devalue, having less importance on some of the finer grain details that we're shooting for in 2019-2020.
I would say that we were successful in taking out the 4-5 blended classrooms last year, but
I remember you doing the math on the whiteboard in the middle of the meeting. It was very impressive.
So I would say that with the variables of the pandemic, we have to be creative in meeting the needs of the individual parents' decisions about their children. And so we're having to create as much flexibility as we can in order to address everyone's requests in terms of in-person learning versus continuing with distance learning.
Okay,
So I
thank
don't
you.
really have an answer because it's really
Yeah.
specific to the family.
I totally get that. I was going more for like, general approaches, and I think you answered that. So thank you, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, I believe you have your hand up.
I do. Although I was toying with pulling it down because I feel like I have thoughts that are not quite yet fully formed questions, but I'm going to give it a shot, and whatever isn't clear, we can just set aside for now, and maybe it becomes a discussion point for us for CBRC. Maybe that's what I'm doing, is just throwing some ideas out that I would love for us as a committee to explore more as we get into the working session part of this. And I am not taking notes. I don't know who is, but maybe we should have kind of a running list of things that we want to track, so that as we get closer to being ready to build out our report, which is not that far away, we need to be thinking about that ASAP. We keep some of these things in mind. Okay, so with that wind up, let me just say a couple things, and we'll see what sticks and what makes sense. Building, Judah, off of where you were going, one stream of thought that I'm having is that while I fully appreciate the complexity with staffing and trying to do any sort of staffing at this point in the year, given all the reasons and variables, Claire, you just mentioned, when I think about, like, from a parent perspective, from a classroom teacher perspective, principal perspective, like, those are some of, like, the super important things that we need to try and figure out and know. So I'm just wrestling with this idea of, like, what are some of the things we can try and give some assurances around sooner rather than later, acknowledging there are complexities. Again, related to staffing, I've been clear and candid about this before. I'm curious about sort of the cost associated with lowering class sizes on the margin versus the impact that would have. And someone should shout if you're having trouble hearing me. My internet connectivity is terrible right now. I'm going to try and move as I'm talking.
You sound fine. And also, I guess Sudi's taking notes. She'll be keeping minutes as well. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Everyone else's camera images keep coming in and out, which suggests I have a bad connection. So, so just let me know if at some point it becomes less clear. So yeah, I guess I'm curious about kind of the cost or estimated costs associated with, trying to lower class sizes going into the fall on the margins versus other, spending that money in other ways, staffing up on kind of like the paraprofessional side. I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that paras, if well supported, can provide the kind of high dosage tutoring or small group instruction that has demonstrated to have a high impact on learners. And if going into the fall, one thing we know is that, kids have missed out on, a certain amount of learning and would really benefit from learning acceleration. I'd love to explore and try and pinpoint in the budget places where we're thinking about expending funds in that way rather than, lowering class size by 1 or 2 kids on the margins. And then the last stream of thoughts I had, and then I'll stop talking for now, is that as we are making these decisions, and I did tune into the board meeting night before last, so I know we talked, and I think we're going to talk about some of the map data we have right now. I see, and on this slide that's up in front of us, successful schools survey data. I think my big question is, what are we grounding these decisions in terms of which schools have the greatest needs and therefore need more resources, which specific student groups within those schools or any schools are the ones that we really need to target. I know in general, we have set priorities around Black and Indigenous students. And I know we have identified schools, CSI, TSI schools, that are sort of being held harmless, and those schools will continue to be in identified status moving forward. And I think that we have a ton of variability in terms of what experiences kids have had this past year and a half within schools. So how do we know, which kids need the greatest supports right now, and therefore that's where we're targeting services and building the budget for those targeted services. So that was a lot. So again, I will stop and thanks for indulging me, but I would love at some point for CBRC to, ask ourselves, do we feel like we have good information and that we feel like this budget is really grounded in student needs in ways that we feel comfortable with as community members and family and parents. So, so yes, I will stop there, but a couple thoughts for us. I would love to, get reactions or other questions, things on folks' minds right now as we think about turning the corner from looking at the budget and talking about it to our own perspective and reactions to it.
Roberto, were you going to share some information with her, or did you want me to respond some?
Oh, I do have some comments, but I was trying to give this space in case other CBRC members wanted to chime in and share. But I will share, Sarah, something that does resonate with me that you said is regarding like the having an understanding around classroom sizes around the margins, because that was something that was I've worked on previously in like, hey, reducing class size by 1 or 2, okay, that may be helpful, but from an instructional perspective, you really need to cut that class size by half, right? Or, get down from, 28 students to like 12 students, or, as you like the literature and talks about impactful. And so from managing that, that's my takeaway. It's like understanding that formula numbers. I knew it in my previous system where like, hey, every one student equals so many dollars, but then what does that mean for the classroom and the dynamics and understanding that? Because there is something to be said to understand the trade-off there. Hey, that 1 or 2 student savings could then be reinvested somewhere else, and having the conversation regardless of where you are in the argument regarding a smaller class size by 2 can support classroom management, but what does that do for learning? Right, and there's one way or the other, and then hey, those dollars could be moved somewhere else to support a different type of program or initiative. So I think that is definitely something that resonates with me to further unpack and have the conversation. And Claire, as far as like what areas we focus on, like how do we know, what do we know of need and where to shift dollars? I know that one of the key things in the formula, in the staffing formula, is maintaining the equity portion of the formula and keeping it at the level, and understanding that if certain schools or areas that meet certain thresholds, or schools that meet certain thresholds regarding historically underserved students, that we still want to be able to provide those additional services. And it's still like kind of like a wait and see, hence leveraging data from 1920 to create stability. And Sarah, if I understood correctly, it's like, how do we go beyond stability and just like really enhance and continue to really push into those areas? And I don't have like the right answer, but I understand what you're saying. But Claire, I don't know if you have additional insight to share.
A little bit, and I'm thinking in our March presentation, we put the cost that was the difference in the staffing, but I could be wrong, but that's where I would go to look for it. But we can certainly get you the dollar amount of what's at risk, because the issue is we don't know how many students are going to come back, right? And so what we decided was if we had every elementary school would have lost a teacher or 2, right? And some could have been more. Because of their primary grades being smaller, and so that much change throughout the system, where you're moving teachers around all across the district, is a significant impact on every elementary school, and the culture that's developed in that school. Managing all the DLI programs that we have, having all the IB primary year programs, lots of different kinds of programs throughout our schools. So it's very disruptive to break up teams and move them based on seniority across the district to lower that allocation. So the assurances that we could give to parents is that we are still holding true to our staffing allocation numbers for maximum class size. So that hasn't changed. So there are those assurances to parents, and that's still in place as it has been before. In terms of learning acceleration, we have promoted one of our principals, and she actually presented at the board meeting Tuesday night about the summer programs. And she has, right now staff are identifying students that could benefit from learning acceleration that will start this summer. And so right now we do have the MAP tests from mid-year. And so we'll be using those as well as staff assessment in the classroom about the students that need the extra supports, and then bringing them forward and inviting them to the summer programs for learning acceleration. So we will continue. We do have intervention teachers, specialists, instructional specialists in our schools as well, that will help exactly with that learning acceleration. So I'm trying to read your thing here as I'm speaking, and it's not working very well. Let's see.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And so I do want you to know that we have a team working, and we're working quickly because as you know, the money came forward very recently. We have an RFP for a lot of community partners to also work with our. Especially we're working with credit recovery at the high school level to ensure students are on track for graduation. And in June, we'll have some immediate, as school gets out, so students that didn't complete a class will have immediate supports in place for credit recovery, so they don't have to do the course again, but just the parts they missed, right? And then they can catch that up quicker rather than trying to do the whole course. And then, so what are we grounding our decisions in? The successful school survey and the MAP assessment, both. And then you're correct that we are supporting our CSI, TSI, and title schools, as well as focusing on our Black and Indigenous students. And so all of, our English language learners and our special education students will all be, identified for support this summer as well. So really focusing on that. The wonderful news is we have a lot of resources that we must spend by the end of September. And you bet we're going to spend every dollar on our kids in getting that intense learning over the summer, and also some fun. So we have the morning acceleration, we feed them lunch. They can either take a bus home then, or they can stay and have some fun times with art and music and sports and whatever activity our community partners, they're going to be submitting proposals to us in a wide variety of things for our kids.
I love the idea that you're going to sell the youth of today on summer school is fun. Damn it. I'm behind you, Claire. Make it fun.
A joyful experience. That's what I'm going to say.
No, I'm just saying I love your optimism, Claire. I'm right there for you.
So hopefully, Sarah, that helped. And then I'm going to go back on mute.
And I believe, Brad, you had your hand up, and then Lisa.
Yeah, I think one thing I would maybe suggest, Sarah and Judah, is one of the things we talked at the last meeting was trying to identify and set what the criteria is that we're going to use to, kind of evaluate the budget. And I think if we can maybe try and get through the next two presentations kind of fast, so that we can actually have time to talk about that. I think we're getting in the weeds at this point, and I think what we need to do is try and figure out what we are, how we're going to actually evaluate the budget, because we're, kind of in danger of not having enough time for that. And I think we need to decide if what we were doing last year is possible this year. At the very least, it's going to be modified. But I think that it's going to be significantly modified. And I think saving a lot of time for that, I think, is a smart thing.
And I am open to opening it up for additional conversation. And we all have the slides and we can always come back to it. I think those were really the three key ones I wanted to point out.
I think, I think there's one more hand raised.
Oh, yeah, my apologies. Yes, Lisa.
My question, I think I appreciate Brad's comment about moving on. And I just had two questions regarding summer and support, and maybe some of what Sarah was asking about for staffing for next year. Of the kids who didn't come to school this year, whether that's lower grade or opted out, how is the district, and we don't have to answer this now, but how is the district reaching out to those students who may or may not come back, who are going to potentially need a lot more support, and or if they didn't come to kindergarten, are they going to go to kindergarten this coming year? Or are they going to go to first grade and really need support to stick to their age group and whatnot? So that's just a question there. At the budget meeting the other night, at the board meeting, I think it was the student representative was asking, he asked about the summer programs, and he said, for the kids who have done fine with digital learning, but feel like they didn't get as much as they wanted out of it, what opportunities are for them to accelerate their own learning? And I think some of the response was really targeted toward opportunities for employment, opportunities for the kids, and or some leadership positions. But it didn't seem like the question really was answered as far as for kids who have done okay. And I think this goes into next year too, of kids who have done okay, what are we providing for them so that there's additional support for kids who have had trouble, but for kids who also want to keep on target for themselves? And that we don't have to answer that tonight, but that's just something that came up to me. And then I also think as we're starting to think about criteria, and we look at even the slide you have up here, what would be really helpful, and I think I've worked in budget and trying to dive into the school's budget, what can be helpful, and I think as we're trying to develop metrics for how we measure this, it's really hard for me to know how many, it's a lot of money, but how many students are we serving? And I think same for when we're talking about programs for underserved communities, really how many students that we're trying to impact and help. And it's really hard to dig into all these numbers and walk away with a solid foundation of how, and I think this question came up the other night at the board meeting, of how are we communicating how specific funds are being used for what, and why we may have a budget shortfall on some things like your operational costs, that we don't have all the money to support that if the state doesn't provide it. So that's a lot I'm saying, because it's just kind of running through my head of, okay, how are we going to really make a check of, are we meeting the goals that we set out, and the students, and how many we're trying to impact? I guess that's my point. So I'll stop talking there, but just a few things that came to mind.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for sharing that. One of the items I've noticed in our budget, we have a wealth of information, and it down to specific percents or funds and the impact to students. And I think the crux of the work is going to be how to bring that to like specific initiatives, to your point, or funding streams, and being able to do some of that data analysis and breaking that out, because it will help tell the story. And that's, I think, part of something that is important to me to get us to that point, because it'll help with that conversation of like, hey, well, if the budget's grown by $150 million, I don't understand why you're short, or what's this conversation about being short? It's like, well, okay, well then, how do we tell? How can we be better at telling the story? Like, okay, well, that is the school state funding formula, and that is actually shrinking by X. So now we're relying on other funds to compensate, but then some of the other funds are restricted, whether it's for high school success. So we can't use high school success for elementary supports or things like that. And so as part of my learning, I'm like, oh yeah, there's an opportunity to help tell some of that story better, so that we can then be clear that Measure 98 funds are supporting X, and it's from one year to the other, it represents so much per pupil investment, and that's like carved out, right? That's restricted for specific usage, and so then it can't compensate for another area. And what even like the school state funding formula, for example. And what gets more complicated this year is that we have the ESSER funding that also like inflates the numbers. I mean, it's real money, it's real dollars to invest. And so not until we start carving all those pieces out does it help to further tell the story. And there is a slide here that it's like the evolution of starting to have that conversation. And where I like, this is probably super small on your screens, so let me make this a little bigger. But right, getting back to like the other slide of breaking up the different funds and what they're for. But on the next slide, I then start getting into some of the very specifics. Oh, well, let's break it out, right? Let's really carve out some of the key funds within the general fund. So now we've double clicked into the budget, and hey, local option levy, those property taxes, right? I'm looking for a home, getting a home, so I'm experiencing that. And so, but then that's very specific. But not until we double click, triple click into it do we start seeing, oh wait, well, what's really happening with the state school fund? Okay, that we see it, went up by a little. There was a delta there. Oh, and then the expected change for next year is, about $11 million. So then I think this is getting to the point of like, well, how do we start telling that story that like, well, there's these funds as a whole, looks like it's just a big budget that's grown by so many millions of dollars. And in the special revenue fund, it's just another example of like, okay, well, student investment account, right? Specific goals, explain usage. We are just using high school success as an example. So again, when we look at like the delta from, for example, student investment account, seeing that $19 million increase, right? On its own, it's like, wow, that's huge. But then it's like, wait, well, that's where we were supposed to be. So they're just we're just like making up for where we were supposed to be. And then, right, High School Success Act, about a little over $1 million or almost close to $2 million increase. But again, that is specifically for those programs. And then Lisa, like all that to say, sorry, I'm being long-winded, is like, then it's like, how do we then get to like the per pupil and further telling that story? The volume 2 of our budget book, yes, we have volume 2, right? It's like 200 pages. It gets more into the school level and provides more insight. But again, I think like there's an opportunity here for us to tell that story that can then be tied to some of our strategic planning, and then have a clear through line as to how we're measuring the results here. So yeah, I definitely opportunities to continue to tell this story, and I think with these slides here, it's like starting to get to help that. And Irina, I believe your hand is raised.
My hand is up. So I want to steer us into the matrix that Lisa said that we need. You showed us the revenue piece, the income piece. What we really need help from you is the cost, expenses, and how you're going to spend these income pieces. And that's what we are not quite seeing in the budget. So we have the revenue part. Yes, we got it. And we see that you are not getting as much as you expected. But we have difficult time seeing the expenses part. So how you are spending this received revenue. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where like the explained use here, for example, with high school success. So it's like, okay, well, we have $13 million or so that can be used to invest in these programs. So then like the next component would be to call out like, and I'm asking a question here, like would the next component be to call out, hey, there's these schools have so much going to them from, or there's these programs or initiatives that are receiving so many dollars from the High School Success Act. I guess it's like trying to distinguish, we can share additional detail, but it's like the granularity of the expenditure, right? Because like the general fund will show there's, X percent that goes towards teachers or licensed credentialed staff. There's so much that goes to the finance department. And so like there could be to that level, right? Like, oh, well, for every dollar that gets spent, for every dollar received, 30 cents goes to the CFO's office or whatever the case is. So I think that as in being responsive to get that information, I think it's like trying to modulate there. I'd be happy to get additional feedback and insight on that. And the volume 2 was sent about a week or so ago. It was an email from Nicole. Yes. Yep. So I'll stop talking, and these were some of the key things. I know that there are a few other items, but I definitely want to turn it over to CBRC to see what other questions or what are the next items the group would like to further discuss. I'll stop presenting as well. This was the last slide.
Sorry, I was just tracking down the part 2 of the budget. So thank you for that, Claire. I eventually found it. So it was sent out on the 16th, and Brad just pasted the link to the online version in there. So that answers some of the school-specific funding questions for those that aren't familiar, because it's a very different view, and one that a lot of local groups commonly ask, well, like, what does this mean for my school? Volume 2 is one of the things that attempts to answer that kind of question. So
there's also a summary of schools, and I have not seen that this year. So Norberto, something we should go back to the team on is usually once that school summary is produced, and maybe it's at the beginning of the book this year, is it has a summary showing a lot of achievement data and a lot of enrollment data and the type of students that are there, and dollars per student, but it's all, you can see easy. You're not having to turn pages to see one school after another, but you have all the schools on a big page.
Yeah, there's a school summary. They got the exact summary.
I think maybe at the beginning of
7 through
volume
9.
2.
Yeah, it's the beginning of the volume. Yeah.
Great.
That's awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay. So, going back to our, kind of modified agenda, would folks like to dig into some of the questions, like to the question that Brad was picking up, going back and revisiting what is our lens for analyzing this, or would the group prefer to get into the map testing data and information, which we also have on our agenda? I am open, especially since I was not able to make it to the last meeting.
I'd like to hear others' perspectives on this. I think we heard one or two moves, right? Pretty clear calls for us to really dig into discussion of metrics. So unless anyone disagrees, I think that's one clear proposal for us to dig in. But, I think I don't want to dismiss the importance of the map data. I think many of us listened to the presentation that was given a couple nights ago. We have the information in front of us. I do think that kind of connects in some ways to the conversation about metrics and how we're going to evaluate this budget. That's my proposal, is that we move, but I would love to hear if there are folks who feel like we're not ready for that metrics conversation and there were other things you hope to have answered either by Claire or Norberto before we dive into that conversation. And I'm having horrible internet issues, so I apologize. I can't even seem to get off mute without 10 attempts. So thanks for bearing with me. I can only sort of see folks. I don't know what's going on. Maybe my computer is sending me a signal that I need to be on it less or something.
Well, we can hear you fine.
Well, that is good. That is good to know. So are folks generally, since a lot of you, at least your cameras are off to me, I can't read any facial cues. Are folks generally feeling ready to move into this metrics conversation in earnest? I can only see like Brad and Lisa. I saw one head nod.
Yes. I think we have a broad ranging yes. Brad, since this was your suggestion to pick up and one that's very well taken, would you be willing to kick that off? And since I think you've got a pretty good structure in mind.
I think we need to decide, because we need to look at what the other board goals, because we were looking at those metrics, and I don't think in the map testing it actually addresses the metrics. The data that's in those map reports is not disaggregated to any sort of a degree that we can actually use those board goals, that we can actually write this report. If we want to continue to use those board goals, we are going to need quite a bit more information than is what is in that map presentation, because it does not have the level of detail that we're gonna need. So if that disaggregated detail is available, then we can continue to use that in a kind of a hybrid fashion. But I think we need to decide, what is best, for the most kids, in the most places, because that's kind of what, a lot of this is. And I think, we can look at these reports that Norberto was, putting together. But, at the end of the day, and we can definitely, in those things where you're talking about double clicking on stuff, Norberto, I think is very, very useful. But we need to figure out, what are the goals? And I don't even know if the board has, figured this out. What are we looking at? What are we right now? Because they knew what they were in 2020 or 2019 and 2020. And I think kind of going forward, we need either to develop that ourselves, or we need to reach out to the board and ask them, for that guidance.
So Brad, can I add a couple of sentences here? Dr. Russ Brown has stated that after the map testing in the fall, that he'll be working with the board, and the board has stated that they'll be reassessing their goals. So I would not necessarily I think that we have map data to map data. We have the analysis from Dr. Russ Brown from our mid-year map assessment, and that's probably our best data to use and giving our board an opportunity post-pandemic to relook at our district goals after the map assessment in the fall.
Because
So
that makes
that-
it that makes it super hard for us to write the report based on, you know, those board goals, because I don't think that we can do it. And therefore we need to figure out, okay, how are we going to evaluate, you know, this budget? Is it, you know, what is it aligning with? I think that there's, that's a difficult discussion. I think at the end of the day, we could probably all agree we want to help the most kids the most, right? And I think, you know, other than that, I don't know exactly what, you know, what it is. And I think that's, the discussion that we really need to have.
So, Arena, I see you've got a hand raised. Do you want to speak to that, please?
Yeah. I looked at both volume 1 and volume 2, and volume 2 looks appropriate for the levy evaluation, because it kind of like, it tells you where we are at each school. But what we might use for the budget evaluation is the informational section in the volume 1 informational. After you kind of like skip after taxes, there's information on psychological comfort, special education, English as the second language. So take a look if you have a book and see if we can use this information as the foundation and as the basis of our kind of like evaluation, how they did the budget.
So it sounds like one possible path forward. I don't know if you all should correct me if this is not the right interpretation of these suggestions, but one potential path forward is us to really lean in on equity and really try and, you know, examine the proposed budget by applying, you know, whether it's the ResJ lens that we've been introduced to previously, or looking at, Irina, as you were suggesting, like, you know, the spending for certain student populations that have often, you know, been held furthest from opportunity, and that, you know, we have some evidence to suggest, you know, whether local or just based on national data that's been collected, that, you know, there's, you know, certain student groups that have been more impacted than others over the course of this past year plus and historically. And you would expect that the budget would reflect additional resources and supports, right? Like, that's why we have the equity allocation, et cetera. So I think, you know, one proposal, it sounds like, is for us to really look at the budget from that equity perspective. I know we've talked about this a few other times. I'm curious how that lands with folks and what other thoughts folks in the group that we haven't heard from yet have in reaction to both Brad and Irina, and just generally zooming out and thinking about whether we really lean in on kind of the equity analysis.
Well, I am I'm taking a look. I admit that I had not looked at volume 2 because I didn't realize we had gotten it. And so I looked through, I had spent time with volume 1, but I'm not, for instance, finding where we're laying out the equity allocation proposals for the coming year. Do folks know where that is?
I guess I'm speaking. I find it on pages 214 and 215 in volume 1. And it's FTE spending for FTE for this kind of like special needs and special program. And they have 2022 projections in there.
But it was my understanding the special programs was actually SPED and was
It's listed as FTE by major function and employee type, and includes kind of like all the major functions of the school district.
right. I know, but PBAM function number 12, special programs, instructional activities for students with special needs, which I think is what you're speaking to.
You look at all the functions in the table, the whole 2 pages, not just one
Yes.
line that you did.
Right. Right, but I'm saying that I don't see, for instance, we have the equity allocation, but the equity allocation going to schools that need additional support or having students with additional needs of additional support is not reflected in this that I'm aware of.
Let's ask Claire and let's
Yes.
ask, maybe they can tell us where we can find what your question was.
So on the school reports,
Mhm.
and I don't have Volume 2 downloaded on my country internet. It will take longer than this meeting.
All right.
So I can't, so Noberto, I don't know if you have the Volume 2 downloaded. If you can look in the summary sheet at the beginning of the Volume 2 to see if the equity staffing allocation is on that sheet. I do know that it is broken out on the individual school sheet.
Yeah, I'm seeing, achievement percentage, students per FTE, dollars per student. I have to turn every one of these because I'm looking at the PDF and I have to turn it twice.
We'll get a chart for you.
All
Let
right.
us do that for you.
Okay, yeah, I'm still not seeing that in there. So I don't.
So we'll get a chart for you.
Okay.
So that you guys know exactly the equity allocation to each school. It does get allocated in terms of teachers, but they're able to use it in many ways. So
Right, and this is still the FTE support where it just says we'll give you this many FTE. 1 FT.0 FTE is a full-time teacher, but it's 2 classroom assistants or like scheduling folks or like any of the classified staff. Correct?
Along those lines, is there any? So we're looking at a lot of numbers, but I wonder if there is a descriptor of how we're trying to reach these goals as well as focusing on equity. Is there a way to know what each school is doing that lays out what they're implementing, not just in numbers, but like what the goal is for each school to reach to to make things more equitable? Like what is each school doing? And I think some of this gets caught up in, if you look at, I kind of glanced through Volume 2 and you look at, okay, some schools are more diverse than others, but what are we doing as schools to make those schools that aren't as diverse more welcoming, right? And I think, I don't know how, even the term historically underserved, I think in some ways can be a disservice in that, it's kind of like using homeless versus houseless. Like how are we trying to put this in a way that it's like that I don't know, there may not be an answer, but I think to me, that's kind of what I was asking before. Like, it's really hard to just look at the numbers and say, okay, we're meeting these goals. There's no, like, where's the qualitative side or the qualitative side of what is each school doing to try to solve this problem that has been historically an issue for City of Portland. And so that to me is more of like and then that gets relayed to the community, right? Of like, what is our commitment, not only as a district, but school by school? What are we doing to make it better, make the schools more welcoming, make it so that everyone can feel that they can go to any school across the district and be served and be so I guess I kind of feel like that's missing here, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, but.
So, Lisa, I can speak to a little bit of that with a slight historical perspective. So, the equity allocation is a specific set aside of a certain number of FTE that, as Claire mentioned, could go to full-time teachers in order to reduce class sizes, could also go to student supports, like reading tutors, targeted interventions, depending upon the needs of a school. And then it's actually the overall equity funding is spoken to in volume 1 on page 218. Speaks to the overall program and kind of some of the demographic breakdowns, but not the breakdowns per school. And the way that it had been done internally, and for a while the information was shared, but is not anymore, each principal, based off of the equity allocation for their school, based off of their demographics and needs and such, says, okay, you get, say, 1 or 1.5, 1.25 FTE. For equity allocation. Now, as the principal, you have to come up with a plan for what you're going to spend those FTE on and what you expect the outcome to be. Like, for instance, targeted reading intervention to raise third grade, reading standards. And so saying, we're going to spend it on this, and then we expect to get this kind of outcome. And originally that information was shared with us, what kind of the plans were coming in. That is no longer the case. It's something I've pushed for, but I understand that within staffing, it's something where these are continuous improvement programs, working with the kind of staff at central office who work on school improvement issues to try and make sure that like best practices are shared and goals are being met. But it's true that we don't have that available as public information any longer.
Okay.
Building a little bit off of what Lisa was mentioning, I think knowing where this money is going is super important, but also, we have a bunch of money going to different initiatives, supporting the board goals, this equity, discretional funding. I would like to see at least some accountability in that funding to kind of see how it has improved outcomes, and seeing maybe there are other ways that we could try to help improve outcomes even more. So performance measures essentially is what I'm kind of asking in the future, to see that the money we are investing in the best way possible.
So Jackson, I 100% agree, and I appreciate you for being a consistent voice in raising this. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's like Ken very much, and I would love to hear if others, how others on the committee feel, but I think for sure part of the message we can send in our report is, just underscoring. It won't be the first time we've sent this message, to be clear. I think it's been a consistent message that we've sent over the past X number of years, at least 4 since I've been doing this work. But we, I think, have another bite at the apple and another opportunity to really underscore the importance of measures, of data, and both starting with clarity around, where the money is going. And so it's like, are we doing what we said we were going to do? And what difference is it making? And what are we learning as we're going? I think there are huge opportunities for us to get so much smarter on this. And I think it's one reason why we keep having these circuitous conversations where it's really hard to evaluate a budget, because we don't have information to operate on, especially this year. So I would love to see us push on this again. And Jackson, you have been really thoughtful. So if you have specific language that you'd like to start playing around with for us to include in the report, I would love for you to take that on in some way. I don't think it can be the entirety of our report, but I think it absolutely has a place in it.
The one thing I will highlight for you is that our updated strategic plan will be out in June, and it will include metrics for the various strategies on the system shifts. So that will come. It won't come in time for your report, but we will complete it by the end of June. So there's hope for the next year is what I guess I'm trying to say.
I'll add, thinking about how what's the through line with the racial equity and social justice lens from a budgeting perspective? And how do we start thinking about not just the outcomes, but what are the leading and lagging indicators to support that? And putting those pieces together to then also start having additional conversations around resource alignment, right? Because once we have a general sense of what our leading and lagging indicators are, then those are other focal investment points as well. So it's like being able to just start putting all these pieces together, and on top of me continually to learn our context and putting that together. So I'm excited to be part of the team working to flesh out the strategic plan and really thinking about metrics, because obviously then metrics are some focal areas where we can think about how we're investing and supporting them.
Hey, Clara and Alberto, this is Brad. I got a quick question. I think it specifically focuses on what we mean by the phrase learning acceleration. That seems to be kind of throughout these documents, and I think what Lisa was saying, I think it kind of touches on a couple of different things. Does learning acceleration meaning bringing kids up to grade level, or allowing students to accelerate their learning at whatever pace that those kids individually can? I think in the past there's been a lot of pushback on, there's going to be some kids that actually did okay, during this shutdown, that, for lack of a better term, might be bored with some of the remedial things that would need to take place, or some of the learning acceleration. And I want to make sure that the learning acceleration actually is for all students, and not just the students that have suffered during with this. And I appreciate you putting through this. I think that there's been a decent amount of pushback on the part of the district for allowing kids or even encouraging kids to take classes at a faster rate. And I think we need to be, as a district, I think we need to kind of look at that, because if this whole thing of online learning has taught us anything, it's that there's different ways to do things. I think that we can offer different programs. We can spread it out over different schools. I think we can do a better job of meeting the needs for more students, both the ones that are succeeding and the ones that are, struggling. I think if you could tell me, what, that learning acceleration means to you guys, that would kind of help.
So both Noberto and I put definitions from, so I picked one from more from education, reform leaders in education. And I don't know what reference Noberto's is.
Yeah, actually just from recent conversations at the board and listening to our new director of learning acceleration, and who's I forgot where she was a principal at in our schools, but just thinking about that approach where it is, I think, intentional around supporting all students, and giving them an opportunity to finish, to go through and finish that unfinished learning. And I will admittedly say that I'm also still thinking about, like, what does it mean from a transformational perspective? I think, Brad, to your point, that's I think the crux of the question. You know, what are we taking away and doing differently? And I think that's also going to be shaped by where we land with our strategic plan, and have that guide some of that conversation. But Claire, I don't know if you have additional comments on
I guess in both of these definitions, neither one of these addresses kids that are succeeding or exceeding plus. And the district, you know, when I've asked, you know, these questions, what about kids, you know, that are actually doing quite well? What are we offering those kids? And there's been a huge amount of pushback saying we are not going to allow those kids, you know, to take accelerated classes. We are not going to allow kids to go on a faster path, you know. And I guess as a district, I would be really curious, you know, what that term learning acceleration, if it means to accelerate the learning of the kids, you know, that are, that are struggling. I think we are not serving, you know, if we are just focused on learning acceleration, we are by definition, you know, ignoring the needs of a certain amount of the kids. And so I guess that's what I'm kind of learning for.
So Brett, the summer programs in particular have a two-pronged approach. There's the learning acceleration for the kids that need to catch up to their peers. And there is also an enrichment component where, you know, there's joyful learning occurring with students in lots of different ways and whatever their interests lie. So we are doing programs for both, but the learning acceleration is specifically for students that need extra supports to catch up to their peers in their classrooms. And so that's why the staff identifying them is really an important component, is their teachers know who needs the extra supports to get there. And so, but all students can participate in the enrichment activities K-8. I would say the state focused on credit recovery for 9-12, and really the enrichment components coming out as a K-8 piece of the grant.
And I think that's my concern, is that, you know, even there, I heard you say that the learning acceleration is only for kids that are struggling. And that's, I understand that there's the enrichment courses, but the district is not willing, you know, to offer additional courses for kids that are meeting or exceeding. And I think that we do a very big disservice for those kids. I think it's easy to, you know, get lost. You know, for the kids that, you know, have struggled, not shown up, I totally get that. We need to focus on those kids. But at the end of the day, we also need to focus on all the students in the school. And if we don't, you know, look at some of those additional opportunities or some of those things, I think we, we're ignoring a certain number of kids, you know, that would benefit from being allowed. If you know, by definition, those two words, learning acceleration, means you get to go faster, right? And I think the district historically has wanted to, you know, really throttle back the learning of a number of students, and that's my concern. So.
So Arena's hand is raised. Arena?
I wanted to comment about Brad issue. Basically, he spoke my mind, because all my kids were in TAG and we were lacking services in the district throughout all the years that we were here. And now my last one is graduating, and I can speak up that he still didn't get whatever was learning acceleration for his abilities and skills, but it's fine. Like my son says, like, Mom, it's public school. What do you expect? But, you know, we have the ability to change the public schools in Portland. And it would be nice to not just ignore the kids who are already advanced and let them kind of like proceed with the speed that they can develop. That's one comment. Another comment was about the accountability in the public education. When we have money we kind of like try to throw this money at the schools who are behind for whatever reason. So we never distinguish, are they behind because of the bad principal and administration and teachers, or they're behind because the population of the students need this kind of like extra money kick in. So ideally, in the both budget and the evaluation of the schoolwork, it would make sense somehow to distinguish when the lagging behind happens because of the bad principal, administration, and teachers, or when it's happening because of the demographics and population. And so far, I don't see in our schools doing it. Okay, that was my kind of like venting out.
Hey, Irina, I've got I'd like to ask a clarifying question about the latter part of it, because I think I understand where you're coming from, but I'm trying to think, especially in our role here, digging into the budget, how would you want to see that expressed ideally? I mean, a budget doesn't typically come out and say, oh, by the way, the principal of Grant High School is an idiot, or something like that. Is not a thing that we puts in budgets, right? So or the principal of Grant High School is awesome, but the ceiling tiles are falling on children's head and they can't study well owing to concussions.
Okay.
So how would you want that represented?
I have an idea, in ideal world, okay? So comparative schools that are sort of similar by demographics and see how they're doing. And if one school is ahead of the curve and another school is way behind the curve, then something is wrong with the administration and teachers. But if the schools, one is, for example, Lincoln, and another one is in East Portland, then probably doesn't matter what administrator or teachers team you put there, the demographics is going to kind of like mess up and pull the students behind. So I would rank the schools, and I would pick the schools that are more or less comparable. And that's how I compare the work of the administrators and teachers.
And so how would that get reflected in the budget?
And I wouldn't make it public. I would make it that the superintendent kind of like knows and values and can say, like, for example, Cleveland and Grant are about the same demographics. So if the students in one school are much better than in the other school, then probably the teachers and administrators in this school are better than in the other one. So I would compare 1-to-1, like I will compare two schools and kind of like do this comparison internally. I wouldn't take it to the public, but the school administration and should be knowing what's going on. I don't know how to put it into budget, but the question you asked, how you compare the schools, that's how I would compare.
All right, cool. And Claire, do you want to speak to that in a moment? I saw you put a comment in the chat.
Yeah, no, it's just responding to an earlier question in the chat. So.
Okay, well, that's something. Irina, would you like to put in as a potential suggestion for us to address? That's really not quite a response to the budget. It is budget adjacent, certainly. Is that something you'd like to have our committee offer up as a communication with Superintendent Guerrero, and then ask for this to be something that perhaps we can help collaborate on, or what is sort of the takeaway you'd like to see from that?
We can put this in the kind of below the line comments, the footnote. the suggestions for the future school evaluation or something like that.
Okay.
Because I don't think we can do anything right now. It's all in the future, how internally the school teams could be evaluated. If
Gotcha.
we are talking about accountability, yeah, in the future,
Yes.
how
No.
it could be done.
Absolutely. And we do have a suggestion, and Jennifer and Alona, I see your hands raised. In the earlier email, which I'll share and highlight, that we had questions from board members that they would like to see CBRC address. So I want to make sure in preparation for our next meeting that we start talking about those. But some of them really are how do we demonstrate, commitment to racial equity? How do we make sure we're making data-driven decisions, which is in the budget principles, those sorts of things, and addressing accountability. So I definitely think there's a section there that if you, Irina, you'd like to really particularly weigh in on the crafting, that would be a welcome place for that. So Jennifer, I think I saw your hand first.
Oh, thank you. So with respect, I want to say that I'm not comfortable with the direction that this conversation is going. And I really want to assume good intentions on everybody who's speaking. I feel like I may have heard a little bit in there that I just, as a CBRC member, hope and ask that we can keep the conversation focused on, if students are not succeeding, the onus is not on the students and not on the demographics of the students we're serving. I just started to feel really uncomfortable with where that went. I'm also not going to point fingers at our teachers and administrators. We can very quickly go very big that we are working within a school system that was intentionally built to support and promote white supremacy. And that I just want to make sure that we are staying focused on, we are talking about how are we going to pull all students up and work to create a school system that works for all students. What that means for equity right now is in my opinion, we have to put more money into serving students who don't have the privilege and opportunities that everybody has. Thank you.
Agreed. And thank you for that, Jennifer. And I do also want to emphasize areas where we can, I hope, speak to and overlap these concerns. I live right by Wrigler, which is now on its 8th principal in 9 years, I believe. And so that's the intersection of privilege, budget, and staffing. How do we have not only highly qualified staff, but how do we help keep them in places where they're most needed? And that's an area that, for instance, we as a committee have discussed before. So I really do think that these are great things for us to dig into, but I do believe that we can find some common ground on those and, bring them under our purview. So thank you very much. Alona, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that there are other people that are thinking the same thing. As a person of color and a young person of color, I was really uncomfortable with that conversation. And I think that I would just, as we're talking about this really long budget, I'd love us to stay focused on those different principles that we established at the beginning, being focused and ensuring that the students are the center, right? And the students that need it the most. I had a question though about the addition that was asked to be placed in a footnote. For all of those things, are we going to be voting on whether to implement those, or are we to have that conversation now? I'm just curious about the process.
I'm sorry, I may have missed the bit you're referring to.
Oh, when Irina had made her suggestion for how things would be assessed based on geographic. I was just curious. I was like, is that going to just be implemented, or are we going to have a conversation?
No.
Okay.
So what we are tasked with doing overall as a committee is coming up at the end with a letter to the school board that's in response to the budget and the principles, in there, ideally focused with the lens that we talked about the budget principles, and our suggestions for what can be improved, not only about the process but about the budget itself, because this is going before them with the proposed budget, and then the school district, the board will discuss it. It'll be read into the record. They'll discuss the recommendations from the CBRC, have discussion with staff, and then staff will make revisions in response to what we suggested and also what the board is making as suggestions and budgetary guidelines. And so we typically will start trying to synthesize the thoughts and ideas and strands from committee members, and then create a common document that's shared, and then we'll go through the iteration process with everyone, asynchronously. Everybody will be able to jump into the document, make comments, suggestions, deletions, etc., and we'll try to craft a letter together and then discuss it at the follow-up meeting before it gets presented to the board. So, cool. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to also call out and thank Alicia for the comment that she just made in there about the feeling the burden of showing up to teach. That is something we all want to be mindful of. So I really want to call that out and thank you, and just have that be a reminder for all of us, especially during really stressful times, thinking about how we present our things. So thank you. And Jennifer, your hand is still up. Did you have something else to jump into? No, we're good. Roger, I saw your hand up before and it's down now.
Well, I was just going to point out that this whole subject of social and racial equity has been a problem that has been addressed in multiple ways for a longer period than the most recent iteration that the district has engaged in. When I first came on CBRC, there were 2 high schools, for example, that were recipients of SIP grants that were $1 million each. And that was an early attempt that obviously didn't succeed. But it's been a long-standing problem, and I'm happy that we're addressing it.
And yet, miraculously, the problem hasn't gone away. You would think by now, all these smart people in a room, we would have solved this problem, right? But I'm thankful for people continuing to show up and do the work. So I want to be mindful of, we've got 20 more minutes on the schedule, and I want to make sure that we use it in a way that feels supportive and productive and sets us up for success in the subsequent meetings and the last part of our process here. So I think that we have one more session next week. We're actually a little less than next week. No, today's Thursday. Sorry, I'm losing all track of time. So we've got one meeting on the 6th, correct? The work session to complete the annual reports. And then...
I thought that was on the 4th.
Is that on the...
I think the public committee, the public engagement, I think, is on the 4th with the board.
Correct. Yeah, we have the meeting on the 4th as far as the public engagement, and then Judith, to your point, that Thursday we have another CBRC working section on the 6th.
I actually don't have the meeting on the 4th on my calendar. Was there an invite for that? I guess I missed it.
I don't think there was an invite just yet. So yeah,
I think it's the work between the board and the public. and we can come and show up, or we
Oh.
can skip it.
Okay, so
It's
that's not a
between the board
proposed
and the
work
public.
session with them. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, it'll be about a 1 hour public engagement,
Yes.
and then
Okay.
they're scheduled to be a board work session thereafter. So,
That,
but it's not
explains.
specific to CBRC like
I-
the other. Obviously, you guys are all welcome.
Yes.
But yeah.
Okay, so the way I see it, I would love to kind of use the last 20 minutes to maybe gather some themes, if we have them, about what we are feeling, the concerns that we want to dig into and articulate about the proposed budget, so that for next Thursday, we can have at least the outline of a document started and shared with folks, so that as committee members, we can dig in and start the process of crafting the letter that we'll then all send. Does that sound like a good use of time to folks? And Roger, I see your hand up digitally.
Well, I only have the question. I agree with what you're proposing, but I also was, as a courtesy, I believe we ought to be addressing Brad's draft letter to the legislature, and time is a wasting about notifying our point of view with the legislators. They're marching ahead. I get notices every day of what the Senate and the House of Education committees are doing, and and of course there's a subcommittee in the Ways and Means that deals with education issues, and part of the discussion about Brad's draft, I noticed there was a suggestion that we come up with a list of who ought to receive that letter and so on, but other than extending the length of this meeting, I don't know how we're going to get everything done. So.
Well, we could take a. I would be happy, and thank you for bringing that up, Roger. It was something that had totally slipped my mind, even though I was working on it this evening. First off, I just want to make sure everybody on the committee has had a chance to take a look at the letter and weigh in on it, and see what they see if there are any particular points of contention regarding it, or whether we feel like it's in a pretty close enough situation that we would all feel comfortable as a committee signing off on it as we figure out the distribution mechanisms for it.
Can we sign it digitally? Can school district help us with the digital signature?
I think that as long as as long as there's no one who sort of rejects the premise of the letter and or has severe, significant issues with the wording, I think if we just put our names in there, there's no need to do a digital signature verifying it. If somebody comes and asks you, did I forge your name, Irina? Like, you could turn me in. It's fine. Like.
The only suggestion I might make about the draft is mention was made of the federal appropriation of $250 million that the state would receive. I think maybe we might delineate how much of that actually comes to Portland Public Schools, lest there might be a misimpression that Portland Public is getting $250 million.
And Jackson, Sarah posted the link to the letter there. Are you able to access that in the chat? Yep, no trouble at all. I am interviewing for jobs and part of several tech leader groups, and every single interview and every single meeting, we still have problems figuring out where everything is and connecting to meetings. I do not know how many CTOs it takes to like actually run a Zoom call yet. So. Alana, I just saw your question in the chat there. So are you asking to discuss that next meeting, or was that part of next in this meeting you'd like to discuss it?
Oh, no, I was just saying for next meeting. I thought that we were working on that. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so these are your themes. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing something, since I wanted. I'm trying to finish up one topic in my head and make sure that we moved on to the others, so that I don't lose folks.
And Ilona, I'll share there are ongoing conversations. I know our chief of staff, Jonathan Garcia, is working with, forgot the two gentlemen who were on last CBRC meeting. So we're working towards having those conversations. Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Well, then, if there are no particular issues with the text, we can add in. Or clarify the section that Roger was sent out, and then we'll send one final email out to everyone with the finalized document and get general thumbs up from folks. We can do that asynchronously. I just wanted to make sure, per Roger, that if there were any big major points of discussion, that we utilize the time we have here together to do that. But sounds like they aren't. We'll finalize the rest of the process asynchronously then. Okay. Great. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I would love, and I will happily take some notes for us as a committee to get some themes and particular top of mind issues that we think as individuals that the CBRC should consider weighing in on in our letter to the board. So we can start that, get that document started and prepare it for more in-depth discussion next week.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I kind of go back to something that, Judah, you said at the very beginning when we all first met at the start of this committee, and it kind of leads into some of the discussion and where we kind of went off target of, you know, really focusing on what we can impact and what we can't. And I think Ilona made some good points of like, this isn't about personal stuff. It's reminding us to go back to the students, and same with Jennifer. And so I think same of when we're writing our comments to the budget and the Board of Education, that we are focused on what we can have an impact on and what we can't. And I think sometimes conversations here lead to other things, but really coming back to that point. And I think for me, the main theme and what kind of came up in this discussion is really what Sarah had mentioned of like looking at this budget from a point of equity. And like that to me is a priority and should be. And then subsequent, we can talk about metrics and data to support the goals that the board had laid out. And obviously in our letter, we are going to indicate that this year is unique and there are so many nuances to it that we have no control over, and really how we can get back on target moving forward in the coming school year. And so I guess one of the themes I think we really should hone in on is equity. That's just my opinion, but just based on the discussion, I think that would be a good focus.
Within equity, which I believe we all broadly agree is like an excellent thing to focus on, are there particular issues with either how the budget is constructed or particular investments that we'd like to call out that we see in there that we feel really speaks to either improving equity that we want to call out as a positive, or that we feel is an unrealized opportunity or like working against equity even?
Yes, I think it's both. I think it's that what is this proposed budget doing, or where we think it's really targeted the funds to best meet the needs of the kids, and maybe if there's missing pieces. I don't know. I guess we need to dive into it a little more to see if there's anything missing, right?
Yeah, so those are the things I'm asking, that like if members have some of those things from our discussions and our analysis of the budget so far, and we'll have more time. Like I want to start calling those out. Like for instance, I posted the letter that we did last year, and like we called out some very specific things. Like we said, we feel that it was not a significant enough investment in K-3 literacy. Like that was a recommendation we made last year based off of what we saw. And, there was, that we recommended the district protect or increase funding for services to support students with disabilities. So trying to make some of these concrete recommendations where we feel like there's opportunities to shape the budget and significantly improve the impact in terms of enhancing equity.
We already raised the topic. Both me and Brad were saying like the kids who are doing okay are not accelerated enough. So maybe in the future, the board can take a look and evaluate the perspective of the students.
And of course, I want to remind everyone as we go through, and I'm taking notes on these, I want everyone to feel free to put out some of these suggestions. None of them mean that they're automatically in there and this is what we decide we're going to do. These are discussion points.
I have a question. I'm sorry. Can I just jump in? This is Leisha.
Yep.
I wanted to know, and excuse me if this has already been talked about. I'm sure it has. In regards to last year's letter, do we know which one of our recommendations the board, which, if any, of our recommendation the board took into consideration and actually put into the final budget?
We should, I want to let people jump into that. The one thing I wanted to point out is that we're making recommendations to the board, but the board doesn't actually write the budget. They just approve it. And it's really, so it ends up being their guidance and recommendations to central staff, which staff are usually like responsive to, because otherwise the budget doesn't get like approved. But I just wanted to clarify like the process that we're in. So we're actually to some extent 2 areas removed, which feels really frustrating sometimes.
So our recommendations go to the board and they go to staff?
Correct. Because we are technically a committee of the board. We represent like their committee that analyzes the budget and provides suggestions on there. The board writes policy for staff, and then the staff tries to implement policy within the in the actual budget, like implementing it as the working rules and where the money goes. So it's when we suggest that more money, for instance, that there's a greater investment in K-3 reading, we don't say we think you should put $50 million more here. We're like, we think there needs to be an increased investment here. We think that we're incorrectly investing over here, and then staff work to figure out the implementation details and actually put those changes into the budget. So it's not a direct one-for-one.
Okay, so then maybe the better question is, in recent history, has this group been able to identify their recommendations and anything that's come out from the board or the school. And I guess I'm asking the question, so when we're talking about strategy, maybe there's a type of recommendation or the way that we write it or the way that it's we suggest it that's more acceptable or that gets accepted more often. I don't know, but it's really kind of like, for me, it's been really kind of like a blind process. And so I'm not sure who are we writing to, who's our audience, and then are we writing for ourselves just to feel like we did something, or are we feeling like folks are listening to what we're writing and that we can see it and what comes out later? And I'm not even trying to get into a deep conversation about outcomes.
No, totally.
Different performance measures.
Yeah, I have felt that a lot myself. And so that's actually been one of the things that we've been changing, some of the things where we're starting to get some better direct communication with the board and starting to have them a bit more involved, because I felt like we were just kind of spinning our wheels, tossing out recommendations, and then and had no effect. I can say that our recommendations have influenced things in the past. For instance, we had a recommendation around increased investment in recruiting and retaining teachers of color, and also moving the recruitment cycle earlier in the calendar year, trying to move the budget cycle, early on, so that we didn't have other districts recruiting and hiring folks and some of the best qualified folks before we put our recs out there. And that was something that folks were very responsive to. And we did see changes in both directing more money towards the recruitment or retention, and also making more of an effort to change some of the budget calendars and approaches to be able to recruit early and be more competitive in that market. So that's an example. So beyond there, yeah, Alana.
Slightly different topic. I'm just curious if the next meeting we can go through our definition of equity that we made before we begin, just to center ourselves so we're all on the same page.
I think that's a fabulous idea. Is that maybe, do you feel like that would be a conversation we could start asynchronously and then come together, at that meeting to make good use of our time? Or do you really feel like that is more of it all needs to be in-person meeting? I'm not really sure.
I'm not either. I think whatever is helpful just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think would be just pristine. So happy to just let that sit or let other people take that bet. Just want to put it out there. Thank you.
I have a suggestion for Elina to circulate her definition of equity, and then we'll all add by email, and then by our meeting we'll know the full definition of the concept.
I want to, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, Irina. That is one of those things where, asking people to start off by doing that emotional work and saying, hey, I'd like this emotional labor for you, and then I'll be, potentially even critical or supportive or whatever. I would personally be very hesitant to ask of that. But it is something, I believe that we have, as Alana just put in the chat, I believe that we have some definitions of equity, both within the district and also, potentially even as a committee, though now I'm questioning myself. But I believe that we can find a starting point without asking someone to bring their personal definition in together. But it is, I think, very much worthwhile digging into and reminding ourselves on. The charter is, we do have a charter, yes. And it is, I'll just send for those who haven't been in there, there's the CBRC space in there with the clever page 1677. That's highly intuitive. Yes. But we're not asking to redefine anything, but having a common understanding of how the language is used and very frequently misused. One of the things I know is a common criticism that I've seen myself is people using words like res-j lens as just sort of a way to clear opposition and such. So without actually digging into what it means. So it's worth it. So there's the link to the charter in our space and the overview. You'll also see in there, that's where I had the link to last year's letter, which I think it would be very instructive for folks to dig into, and then the budget principles. And then I do want to, before we go, I want to highlight there was an email sent out earlier today by Sarah at like 2:59 p.m. that had some questions from the board, things that they would love to see us dig into. And so I think between those three things, some of the questions that they're really struggling with and want community feedback on, plus the budget principles, plus a mutual understanding of equity, I'm hopeful that we can take those lenses and use them in the coming days to look at our budget documents, now that I think we have all of them, and start formulating some points in our response letter. I'll go ahead and start by copying the letter from last year and putting some of the structure together, and then we can start ideation on there and share that with where everybody has edit access. I would encourage folks to bring in comments and use comment threads rather than just deleting and adding, but we'll have it all in editable mode. And then that will hopefully get us some clarity so that next week we can spend most of our time for centering and grounding ourselves, as Alana said, in equity and what we mean by these budget principles, and then working there to refine the letter, and then we can do the final word crafting so it makes it sound all coherent and there's language and proper tenses and things like that asynchronously, and then get final sign off. Do we know the due date for when we need to get that to the board? I'm negligent and don't have it on my calendar.
I thought I saw it was the 11th, but maybe that's too early.
Yeah, May 6th is our work session, but when is the board meeting the 11th?
Correct. Yeah. So
that's where there'll be the vote on the adoption of the no.
The voting would happen on the 25th.
Oh, right. The 11th is when we do the presentation.
Correct. Yeah. So on the 11th, you do the presentation. And as we work towards that, I think it'd also be great as the committee comes together, puts the information together to get a sense of timing and like needed time to convey the letter or excuse me, the recommendation as well. I think as all these pieces start coming together, it'd be great to get a sense of that as well.
Okay. Well, I will block out on my calendar the 7th for wordsmithing and taking all the input that we get on the 6th with an effort to try and get things into a submittable state and get final sign off from folks. Since I currently don't have a job, so might as well block that off on the 7th.
Claire, maybe you can don't board books go out on the 6th that week. That's a Thursday. When do the board books go out for the 11th meeting?
Let me look on the calendar.
I think we submitted our letter as a separate item regardless.
So usually to go in the board packet, we're supposed to have it on a Tuesday, but when it's from you guys, I'm sure we could get it stretched to Thursday because that's when the packet goes out to the board.
Thursday the 6th is when we have our meeting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as long as it's okay that we get it to you late that night on the 6th, I'm happy to stay up late and finish editing. So, okay. Thank you. That is great. I'm also going to save these links that are pasted in here. That way we don't lose them. And then, so are there any other issues we want to wrap up since we're a couple minutes over and take the rest of the document creation process asynchronous? No? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And have a wonderful evening. And then later this evening, I will start a shared document and get it shared out to everyone. And we will start the process of hammering together final recommendations. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, everyone.